Himerius, Logothete of the Course, 906 to 912 CE. One of 10th century Byzantium's most important forgotten men, Himerius's brief stint of prominence has been overshadowed by the turmoil of the final years of the emperor he served, and the two power struggles resulting from that ruler's death. The uncle of Leo VI's final empress, Himerius often fails to attract much notice or interest from students of Byzantine history, who assume that he was just another mediocre aristocrat elevated to prominence by a marriage in the family. While it is certainly true that Himerius's high command came to him largely due to his ties to Leo VI, Himerius nonetheless did possess enough skill and experience to serve the empire well. Although his career ended in defeat and disgrace, Himerius's name belongs on any list of the many capable and accomplished commanders Byzantium produced over the course of the 10th century. We are not all that well informed about the family and early life of Himerius. We know that he claimed an unspecified kinship with the 8th century historian Theophanes the Confessor. Theophanes had been a part of the court of Leo IV the Khazar in the 770s, and our available evidence, slim though it is, suggests that the family had held on to this level of status for a century and a half by the time of Himerius's rise to power. Most likely, Himerius's family was not part of the Anatolian military aristocracy, but rather had more connections in the capital, Constantinople. We know that Himerius did not emerge from nowhere simply because of his niece, but rather that he had previously served as a proto-secretus, which is a high-ranking civic official. To reach such an office in Byzantine society, you had to be born into a very well-connected family, and you would have needed to grow up with the resources to receive a first-flight education, which it's pretty clear that Himerius must have had. So when some popular historians say that Himerius emerged from nowhere because he was Zoe's uncle, that is a bit of an oversimplification. This was a guy who had been serving in the government for years by the time that he rose to prominence. We also don't know for certain whether Leo VI first learned about Himerius or Zoe. Zoe Carbonopsina, who is Himerius's niece, became Leo's mistress at some point in the early 900s. However, Himerius was older and was part of the civil bureaucracy. The proto-secretus and other officials of that level would meet with the emperor, so it's possible that actually Himerius introduced Leo to his niece, and that is how she met Leo, and ultimately how that couple went on to produce Constantine VII. It's also simply possible that Zoe had a reputation for beauty. She was known as Carbonopsina because of her characteristic dark eyes, and then that led Leo to seek her out. He learned that she had an uncle, and then they became friends. It's not exactly clear who met who first, but I just want to talk about this a little bit to make it clear that it is not a safe assumption to simply say that Himerius owed all of his position to the fact that his niece was the emperor's mistress and then wife. He also had some position that he had inherited before that, and while he most likely would not have risen to the same heights without his niece, he was still having a pretty accomplished career even without her. Before delving deeper into Himerius's career, we should talk about his great rival, Leo of Tripoli, who indeed became the great rival of Byzantium during the first 2 decades of the 10th century. Leo of Tripoli had been born as a Greek in the theme of Atalaya, and at some point in his youth he was taken captive during an Arab raid. Rather than being ransomed and then growing up to serve the empire, he instead converted to Islam and then rose to high rank. Leo would become a member of the Emirate of Tarsus. He was the deputy governor there, and he would lead some fairly grand fleets for the various Arab powers who were all ostensibly under the umbrella of the Abbasid Caliphate, although by this period the Abbasids' authority was already beginning to slip, so trying to really explain the exact position that Leo of Tripoli held is a little bit difficult. Suffice it to say that he was able to put together fleets from various emirs and pose all kinds of problems for the Byzantines. Leo of Tripoli was one of the most skillful admirals of his era, and easily the most capable opponent that Byzantium faced during the early 10th century. In 902, Leo of Tripoli really entered the historical record and made a name for himself by sacking the port city of Demetrios in Thessaly. The city today is called Volos, by the way. 2 years after sacking Demetrios, Leo of Tripoli returned with his fleet and sailed right up the Hellespont into the Marmara Sea. At this time, the Byzantine fleet was not at its peak readiness, although it does seem that it must have been at least in decent shape, since within a couple of years it will be able to operate in the eastern Mediterranean. However, the fleet commander Eustathius sailed out in order to challenge Leo of Tripoli, but then decided to return to port before engaging. Strategically speaking, Eustathius' decision is defensible. Had he fought and lost a major battle in the Sea of Marmara, this would have left the capital exposed, at least from the seaward side, and it would have taken a few years to replace all the losses, so this would have enabled Leo of Tripoli to sail around and strike with impunity at various port cities in the Aegean. Leo VI, however, was not very understanding of Eustathius' decision and had him sacked in favor of Himerius. If you have ever seen the great film 976 Evil, you know that he who has the nerve gets what he deserves. Himerius had the nerve to fight Leo, and he took over the fleet. Perhaps he recommended himself, or maybe Leo turned to him because they had become close and he trusted Himerius implicitly. By this point, Leo and Zoe Carbonopsina were more or less living together, and she may have already been pregnant with Constantine VII. We know that he and Himerius had become very close by this point, so most likely he was standing there and Leo fired Eustathius and then pointed to him and told him to take over, something like that. However, Himerius did not have a chance to prove himself early on. He was not tested, as Leo of Tripoli sailed away right after his appointment, and now you have Himerius in charge of the fleet, a command that he will retain up until about 912. It would appear that both Leo and his admiral Himerius assumed that Leo of Tripoli would make for home rather than trying to create further mischief in the Aegean. If that was their assumption, however, they were sorely mistaken. Leo of Tripoli made a bold beeline for the city of Thessalonica, and due to the city's poor state of repair at the time, at least the poor state of repair of its fortifications, Leo of Tripoli was able to seize the empire's second largest city after a siege of only 3 days. This resulted in the taking of a ton of plunder and the capture of some 30,000 prisoners. At a time when the Byzantines were almost always successful, at least in the east, this was a stunning disaster and something of a major embarrassment for Leo VI, who liked to think of himself as a pretty good emperor. The question then arises, should Himerius have done more to prevent the sack of Thessalonica? Should he have pursued and shadowed Leo until he left imperial waters, or was he right to fear that he would be lured away from the capital and either forced into an open sea battle that he'd probably lose, or that Leo of Tripoli would slip past him and go back for the capital? I think that most likely Himerius made the right decision to not pursue. Clearly, if the fleets had been equal, then most likely Eustathius would have engaged. But at this point, it does seem that Leo of Tripoli had a superior fleet to what the Byzantines were offering. Leo VI and some of his immediate predecessors had not been the best at keeping the fleet up to date, so it was probably wise not to engage. Clearly, however, Thessalonica's fortifications being in the state that they were in was pretty inexcusable, and there was a lot of blame to go around, but none of this should be assigned to Himerius, who was mostly a civil servant, and now he was a civil servant / admiral. The sack of Thessalonica was a major blow to the empire, and Leo VI vowed that he would avenge this grave insult and injury to the empire by any means necessary. Leo therefore embarked on a rebuilding project at Thessalonica, and of course made sure to focus heavily on making sure the city was well fortified. He also embarked on a large-scale shipbuilding program in order to build a fleet which would deliver his vengeance into the Arab world. It appears that from the time Leo decided to avenge Thessalonica up until the execution of the operation, that Himerius was always designated as the commander of this expedition. The posting became even more secure for Himerius after Zoe gave birth to Constantine VII in 905 and then married her in early 906. This naval building program took about 2 or so years to complete, and at the end of it, the Byzantine fleet would be much larger and more capable than it had been before. And, luckily for Himerius, this new fleet was his to command, and he would be able to achieve some fame with it. The plan for 906 was for the imperial fleet under Himerius to sail along the coast of Atalaya, where he would pick up some troops from Andronicus Ducas's army, and then sail on to attack the city of Tarsus in Cilicia, one of the more prosperous ports in the area. However, Andronicus Ducas, the fairly newly appointed Domesticus of the East, felt slighted at being subordinated to someone with less experience and achievements. It would appear that in the immediate aftermath of the sack of Thessalonica, Andronicus Ducas was the empire's answer. A few months after the sack of the city, which had occurred in July of 904, he struck into Cilicia or Syria and went on a great raiding expedition, creating a lot of havoc. And this is kind of what made his name. So he felt that he was the empire's instrument of vengeance, and he felt deeply slighted and unappreciated by the fact that he was asked to be subordinated to someone who in his view was most likely in that office just because his niece happened to marry the emperor. There's also the possibility that this is another example of the rivalry between the aristocracy of Constantinople and the aristocracy of Anatolia. The members of the military aristocracy felt that they were the true pillars of the empire, and that the bureaucrat aristocracy was more or less just a burden and was far less important. So there could be some of that going on as well. And because the military aristocracy felt that they themselves were second only to members of the Macedonian dynasty, there's also the possibility of social prejudice, that Ducas simply felt that he was a higher ranking and more honorable man than Himerius, and therefore he refused to serve under him. For the most part, as I will get into when I discuss Andronicus Ducas in more detail, I think that Ducas did not commit treason at this time. He was simply being insubordinate. But that is a different story for a different day. Suffice it to say that Himerius did not receive the reinforcements that he had been expecting, and that the emperor expected him to have. Nonetheless, Himerius was determined to press on with his campaign. Despite not having received the expected reinforcements, Himerius was determined to press on to Tarsus and win a victory for the empire. When he arrived at Tarsus, he was immediately confronted with an Arab fleet that was sent to intercept him. We don't know if Leo of Tripoli was in command of this fleet or not, because that is not specified in the sources. However, it is likely, given that Leo had a strong affiliation with the city of Tarsus. Whatever the commander's name of the Arab fleet, however, Himerius was able to sweep aside the Arab fleet and then make directly for the city. He then landed and managed to seize and sack the city of Tarsus. Unfortunately, we don't have very many details about this campaign, but it is clear that it was pretty surprising that Himerius was able to pull all this off, especially without the full force that he had been promised. Tarsus is approximately equal to Thessalonica, or at least it was at this time, in terms of its population and its importance as a port. So as a mission of revenge, this was a fitting target, and it did help to both bolster the honor of the Byzantine Empire, and it helped to show that the Byzantine fleet was back and not to be trifled with. As with Thessalonica, while this did very much set the city back, Tarsus was not destroyed, and in fact, about a half century later, when it fell to Nicephorus II Phocas, this would be one of his signature achievements. Tarsus had been perhaps the most important of the various Muslim-affiliated cities of Cilicia, and its fall would really signal the fall of Cilicia as a whole. So this did sort of presage future Byzantine victories, but in itself it was more or less just a highly successful raid. At some point in 906, Himerius became the Logothete of the course. This was either prior to his fleet's departure or more likely after his great victory at Tarsus. The Logothete of the course, or as the office is called in Greek, Logothetes to Dromou, was one of the most senior offices in the entire empire. The Logothete of the course supervised a number of civil officials, and this person had direct access to the emperor. In many ways, it would not be entirely inaccurate, even if it is somewhat imprecise, to simply refer to the Logothete of the course as prime minister or head of the bureaucracy or something of that nature. This office must have held some special significance to Leo VI, and the appointment of Himerius to this office showed his full faith and trust in Himerius. The office had been previously held by Leo's former father-in-law Stylianos Zaltses up until Stylianos' death in 899. Stylianos had largely run the empire for Leo in the early years. Leo, of course, was active as an emperor, but he did know how to delegate, and he was willing to turn to right-hand men to do a lot of the daily functioning of the empire. It would appear that from 906 until the end of Leo's regime in 912, that the old role Stylianos had held was now filled by Himerius. So when he was not commanding the fleet, he was in many ways responsible for overseeing the bureaucracy. Leo VI had a number of other things he needed to focus on other than daily business. He had to keep the church happy after the fourth marriage. This would prove to be a problem for decades. And of course, the problem would survive until after his death as well. Leo also was an active scholar and philosopher, so he had to spend a good amount of time reading and writing. And the only way that he could do that is if he had officials he could trust who could run the government for him on a day-to-day basis. And Himerius, as the uncle of his wife, and therefore also the great-uncle of his son, was pretty trustworthy. So Himerius in these late years did a lot more for Leo than will ever show up in any of the sources. And this would have very much helped Leo as he dealt with the constant pushback from the church and as his health began to fade in his last years. We don't have anything like a full portrait of what Himerius was up to between 906 when he attacked Tarsus and 911 when he set out on his Cretan expedition. However, the sources do provide a vague outline of his activities during this time. We know that Himerius remained in command of the fleet and that he was on the offensive in the eastern Mediterranean in both 909 and 910. In both years, he achieved victories and was largely unscathed by the enemy. In 909, he won a victory of some kind or other. We're not sure where or against whom, but apparently it was worthy of being recorded, even if none of the details were worthy of being recorded. In 910, he had a pretty impressive raid into Syria. He sailed all the way to the Syrian coast. His forces then sacked the city of Laodicea ad Mare. He plundered the city and took captives, suffering only marginal losses. The city of Laodicea ad Mare is featured on the left. This is a structure built by Septimius Severus, and since it is still standing today, I assume that it was there when Himerius landed and that he probably stopped to take a look at it. On the way home from Syria, Himerius landed on Cyprus and ended the so-called condominium arrangement with the Abbasids. This was the idea that both sides could collect about half of the tribute from the island and that neither side would exercise direct control. This had been a great arrangement for the Byzantines early on, as the early Muslims basically just swept aside the empire in the east, and they had naval dominance as well, so they could have easily captured the island outright, but they had refrained due to this agreement. Now that the Byzantines were becoming more powerful, Himerius showed a good deal of initiative and aggressiveness by simply seizing the island and then ending the condominium arrangement and making it part of the empire outright. It appears that most of the subjects here were Byzantine subjects, so this might not have been unpopular locally. It probably became unpopular a couple years later, however, because within a year or two, a revenge expedition was mounted by an Arab force and the condominium arrangement was restored. So this proved to be a short-lived achievement, but had Himerius lived longer and had his fleet not suffered the disaster we're about to talk about, then perhaps the Byzantines would have been able to claim Cyprus outright and gain the revenue from that island. The Emirate of Crete had been a major threat to Byzantine control of the Aegean ever since its establishment earlier in the 9th century. Leo VI thought that the best way to prevent another sack of Thessalonica was not only to have a strong fleet, but also to conquer the Emirate of Crete and therefore seal the entrance to the Aegean. In the fall of 911, Himerius set out with the largest expedition to date, with 177 dromons and also 43,000 men. Unfortunately for Himerius, the Emirate of Crete seems to have predicted that he would be coming, and they had enhanced their defenses considerably by the time that he arrived. Keep in mind that after the fall of Thessalonica, Crete would have received a good deal of the plunder. This emirate also received quite a bit of wealth from Leo of Tripoli, who would often give them part of the plunder and take refuge on Crete. So this state was effectively in many ways a pirate state, and business had been good for quite some time. After landing, Himerius initiated a 6-month-long siege on Chandax, the capital, but in April of 912, he departed after he learned that Leo VI was on his deathbed. He knew that the heir to the throne, Alexander, Leo's younger brother, was a bit unstable, and he wanted to get back to make sure that the interest of his niece and his grandnephew were looked after. Unfortunately for Himerius, little did he know that the Cretans had put out a call for aid and that none other than Leo of Tripoli had answered. The two were about to collide yet again. While he and his fleet were on their way home from Crete, Himerius was caught by surprise when Leo of Tripoli and his fleet suddenly appeared and fell upon them. Leo of Tripoli, by whatever means, had achieved surprise, caught the Byzantine fleet out of position, and Himerius' fleet was largely smashed. We don't know the exact extent of the disaster, but clearly it did a great deal of damage to the fleet as a whole, and it would take a few years to fully recover. Himerius and many of his men were able to escape. Himerius made for Mytilene on Lesbos, and then from there he was able to escape to Constantinople. However, he was not able to return to the capital quickly enough to be a major factor in the succession dispute. Not only that, but after his defeat at the hands of Leo of Tripoli, his prestige was considerably lower. When Himerius did finally make it back, he was too late and too weak to help his niece Zoe Carbonopsina and his grandnephew Constantine VII in the succession struggle against Leo's brother Alexander. We don't know the precise sequence of events, but it would appear that by the time Himerius made it back to the capital, Alexander had already secured his power, and Himerius was immediately sidelined. Himerius was disgraced, stripped of his office, and then sent to a monastery. At about the same time, or possibly even a bit before, Alexander had also had his niece Zoe Carbonopsina removed from the palace and forced into a convent. After 6 months at the monastery in exile, Himerius died. The cause of his death is unknown, and we also don't really know his age. It's possible he actually was not even that much older than Zoe. Most likely he died of a combination of shame and possible injury from the final naval battle against Leo of Tripoli rather than age, but again, it is not entirely clear. Had he lived just 6 months longer, so had his exile doubled to a single year, it is possible that Himerius could have been a major player in the succession struggle following Alexander's death in 913. At this time, there was a competition to control the throne, and of course the major contenders were Constantine Ducas, the son of that Andronicus Ducas we talked about earlier, and Romanus Lecapenus. Himerius, as someone who was more accomplished than either of them, could have potentially played a huge role in helping to secure the throne for his grandnephew. Unfortunately for him, however, he was dead, and this would largely be the reason, or at least one of the many reasons, why Constantine VII would not be able to exercise power until he was nearly 40 years old. But that's a different story for a different day, and one I've already covered. So if you're interested in that, look at my videos on Romanus Lecapenus and Constantine VII. Let's now consider the legacy and historical significance of Himerius. Himerius, as I mentioned at the outset, is often overlooked, and we'll get into the reasons why that is. Late in Leo's regime, Himerius took over as his right-hand man. In 906, as I mentioned, he became Logothete of the course, and in that capacity he was one of the most trusted administrators and advisors to the emperor. Even before he took that office, however, he seems to have been close to the emperor and to have assumed a lot of the burden of the office, or at least a lot of the burdens of running the government. Leo, for his part, needed to focus on securing the succession and keeping the church happy, and he was able to devote energy to that task because Himerius could be trusted to run the government in many ways on his behalf. Not only that, but Himerius was a trusted family member who could also command the fleet and do so at a relatively high level. Stepping up during a major crisis, Himerius was able to avenge the fall of Thessalonica and then led the renovated fleet on a series of successful deep strikes into the Arab world, something that is often forgotten. Himerius was clearly a decent commander. Not a military genius, but certainly not a scrub. Yet he struggled in his efforts to capture Crete, and there is no evidence that he made any real progress in the 6 months he was there. This is largely due to the strength of the Emirate of Crete and the defensibility of the island, rather than any deficiencies on Himerius' part. Later commanders would also struggle mightily to crack the nut of the Emirate of Crete. Only Nicephorus Phocas, when he was given carte blanche in terms of resources and time, was able to reduce the Emirate of Crete. And that was some 50 years later, and Nicephorus Phocas was almost certainly a military genius. So Himerius' failure there should not be used against him too much. The one big blight on his record was his defeat at the hands of Leo of Tripoli when Leo took him by surprise and smashed his fleet. The combination of that defeat and then his disappearance from the scene right before one of the most dramatic power struggles in Byzantine history has more or less relegated Himerius to obscurity. He sort of occupied a historical space between the stunning sack of Thessalonica, which really was Leo of Tripoli's arrival on the scene of history in the broad sense, and then the defeat that he suffered at Leo's hands later was more or less just another footnote in the career of Leo of Tripoli's greatness and the great threat that he posed to Byzantine authority. So in many ways, Himerius has been relegated to footnote status because of the way that people choose to craft grand narratives. If the narrative is about Leo of Tripoli, then Himerius was just one of the many opponents that he had to face. However, as I have argued, it is possible that Himerius actually got the better of Leo on a couple of different occasions, especially during the Tarsus operation of 906. So they were equal foes, at least for a minute. Himerius, as I mentioned, also missed out on the dramatic power struggle between Romanus Lecapenus and Constantine Ducas, and that, of course, was a major showdown in Byzantine history, one of the most dramatic moments in the entire history of the empire. Himerius' absence from that scene makes him seem less significant, but of course he could not be there because he was dead, so that can hardly be held against him either. So he didn't show up for a couple of the most important moments in the history of his era. That being said, Himerius still played a major role and deserves to be remembered whenever we're talking about the 10th century and the plethora of interesting people who populated that time period. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Take care, be well, and next time I will talk about Andronicus Ducas.